Are you familiar with the Scapegoat Ritual in Leviticus?
I mean, I have read about it and read some commentaries, but I mean, I'm not an expert by any stretch.
Sure. Well, and I'm not either, but, something interesting about it, I think, can give us some insight into the nature of government as we have it today. I think if you look at the Leviticus story of the Scapegoat Ritual, you have one goat where all of the collective sins are cast onto the back of this he-goat. And this was typically, a smelly goat, a mischievous little goat. And if you've ever looked at goats, sometimes they're silly. Their tongues hang out.
Mm-hmm.
They look like an easy target, like a Looney Tune, like a cartoon. An easy target to put all your, say, that little demon-looking creature, that's the guy that we're gonna blame. So they put their sins onto the back of this little he, and they send it out. The second goat is brought into the high priest. The high priest brings it into the Holy of Holies in the tabernacle, sacrifices the goat in private, nobody sees this, and then takes the blood of the goat and proceeds to sprinkle. He comes out, the priest representing God the Father in this Leviticus, this ancient tradition. So the priest is an avatar. He's a symbol for God the Father in relationship to Israel. He comes out of the Holy of Holies, and he takes that blood of the second goat, and he sprinkles it. And he sprinkles it as if it's his blood offered to the people. And because he represents God the Father in this ritual, it's as if God the Father's blood is pictured here being offered to the people. I like to contrast that imagery with the notion of sacrifice that was going on at the time of the ancient Israel in places like the Incas, in places like the Aztecs, in which it was clearly understood that the people had gathered together before their ziggurats or their temples or their pyramids, and they'd offered a representative of the people, usually a slave or a young child or adolescent, to be sacrificed to appease the wrath of the gods. So it's this movement of the people to the holiest of holies, so that the priest will sacrifice this representative of the profane masses to appease the wrath of the deities. Whereas in the Old Testament, it's reversed. It's the deity represented in the high priest offering his shed blood in an outward movement, going from the hidden holy place to the profane masses. It's not the other way around, of the profane masses going into the holy, but the deity represented by the high priest going to the masses and offering a symbolic representation of God's own blood, of God's own flesh torn apart for the appeasement of the masses in their resentments, their guilt, their anger.
Well, yeah, that's a very interesting contrast. And I think you're right. I think a lot of people, they read things from the Old Testament and it seems barbaric and, what is it, superstitious, but a related example would be, I know a lot of people are very turned off by, Abraham and Isaac But as you're mentioning here, that child sacrifice was not something that was invented in that particular story. That was commonplace. And of course, God stopped Abraham. He didn't have to do it, and he gave his own son for us, not vice versa.
Yeah, exactly. And so what I want to kind of use as a kind of a contrasting metaphor here is this idea that the offering of sacrifice from God to the people, rather than the opposite of the people demanding blood. And that's what I want to get at with the nature of the state itself. The state, I believe, is a continuation of that ritual human sacrificial religion from generations past. That's a perpetuation of that pagan logic, the idea that God is someone who demands the blood of innocents to forgive his anger.
Right, right.
And that's the same logic we have with the state today. It's better that one drug user perishes so that the whole nation does not perish. That's to paraphrase Caiaphas' language when he describes that. He says, you guys don't know what you're talking about. It's expedient that Jesus dies, that we sacrifice his blood so that our whole nation, our whole game is not torn asunder if we allow this man to stir the pot, allow him to break apart the hierarchy and the structures that we have built in our power structure, right? And so what I'm saying is that the state is a religious enterprise, and it's a continuation of the same pagan sacrificial order that the Aztecs and the Incans and all these different worldwide ancient societies practice, which is that the gods demand the innocent shed blood of a misfit, of an innocent, of a marginalized scapegoat. And so we will scapegoat the nonviolent guy with a broken taillight with deadly force. We will scapegoat the civilians living in overseas situations where we feel it's expedient to, incite regime change. We will scapegoat the drug user. We will scapegoat the unlicensed hair salon. Anything that violates our sense of cathartic peace and oneness as a collective, we will chew them out and spit them out. We would chew them and spit them out. And that's kind of where I'm getting at with this theme of this discussion, is that if we think that the state is just it just pops up as just an error in logic, we're woefully inequipped to deal with the nature of the beast that we're dealing with here. We're dealing with something rooted in our anthropology, rooted in thousands of years of ritual repetition and superstition, that it's better that one man die or one man or woman be socially cast off into a prison where they could be assaulted and God knows what else. It's better that they perish so that our sense of security, if we allow their freedom, is endangered.
Yeah, an example I had of that recently, just flying, and I had a bad experience in the Orlando airport. It's not worth getting into, but where the TSA, and normally I'm not one to exaggerate TSA stories, but they were particularly egregious on this one. And I remember, like you see, they were allowing like little young people to not take their shoes off or whatever. And I remember when people were asking about that, like, come on, you can't just wave through somebody who's clearly not a threat. And I remember the official response from not even from the TSA itself, but like from the defenders of the TSA, like of the general public, was to say something along the lines of, well, no, but if it were just understood that, some 60-year-old woman traveling by herself, could just get waved through without getting an extensive search, well, then the terrorists would just all exploit that. So it was, that kind of logic that in order for us to stay safe, we have to subject people to extra scrutiny, even though we know full well they're not terrorists.
Right. It's kind of like the bystander effect. When you see an assault happening and there's a crowd, that there's this sense in which people get frozen in crowd immobility. They can't act. And all it takes is that one guy that's crazy enough to go against the crowd runs to the aid of the person in trouble, and all of a sudden it's like a cascade of mimetic imitation where all of a sudden everybody snaps into motion and they're instantly there to be good Samaritans and figure out how to save the situation. So yeah, I think there's something fundamental to what makes us human that we need to address, right? If we really want to make a substantial critique of the state that has teeth. That's where I'm getting at with this.
Right, and I just to go back to something you said earlier. I'm paraphrasing, but it sounded like you were saying that conventional libertarians, they are being very naive if they think that the existence and flourishing of the state is simply an intellectual error, and that if we could just educate these people, and that's not what it is. And I've had similar thoughts that for agnostics or outright atheists, libertarians, if they don't realize there is this malevolent being that's orchestrating things behind the scenes in terms of this world, that just from their standpoint, it doesn't really make sense. Just the normal evolutionary standard story. Why would humanity be progressing and then all of a sudden be plunged into the chaos of the 20th century? That sort of seems odd if it's just a matter of, we just keep getting better and better and getting more and more fit for our environment. Whereas, the Christian explanation of human history makes a lot more sense to fit those kind of facts, I think.
Yeah, I agree. And even if you want to, for the sake of argument, exclude the possibility of some type of spiritual malevolent being or presence, you would still be without, I think, any evidence to maintain this Enlightenment era notion that libertarians have maintained of this, what I call romantic individualism, this idea that people just plop out as these little walking brains on sticks. They're not moved by passions and desires in their hearts. They're just moved by rational processing of data that comes to them. This is a very bizarre, outdated, and almost cartoonish joke of an account of what it means to be human. And I think so many libertarians just kind of presume this kind of enlightenment. And I know that, we could do justice and say, yeah, it's more nuanced than that. But generally speaking, there's this obsession with my rights, my sovereignty, my individual, integrity. And it makes it look like the cartoon of the libertarian being the person who's on the border of his property line shooting an AK-47 into the sky, doing heroin in front of a bunch of neighborhood children riding their bicycles. And they're like, this is my inalienable right to do this. This is my property. It's like, this is absurd, right? And of course, most libertarians would rightfully say that's kind of a cartoon of what we are. But it illustrates a point, I think, that hits home for the average person who's interacting with libertarian rhetoric, right? That I think we would be very woefully mistaken to not pay attention to that. Human beings are not islands unto themselves. And the Bible's clear about that, right? The Bible says all we like sheep have gone astray, right? And so there's this notion that in the Bible, the biblical view of the self is much, much more interconnected with the desires of their neighbor in a sheep herd-like manner than the, libertarian rhetoric would betray.
Right, and I guess I'm agreeing with what you're saying, and maybe the way I've encountered this phenomenon and try to get my arms around it is that, and you're right, here we're speaking of a subset of libertarians, and here I mean, at least from where I'm coming from, is the way a lot of them argue in practice. So I don't think the stuff I'm going to be talking about flows from the principles of libertarianism itself, which I still think are solid as far as they go. But yeah, I have seen people that they look at like the collectivism that's associated with coercive ideologies, and then their conclusion is any sort of collective thought whatsoever is bad, such that I've actually seen certain libertarians arguing that like tennis is a more libertarian sport than basketball, like singles tennis, because there you're the individual, whereas basketball or football or whatever are collectivists, and so as libertarians we should be skeptical about those sports, which of course is silly, or downplaying the importance of the family and let alone the church if they're atheists, thinking that it's each individual, you're just you grow up in this own world by yourself and you don't need any attachments, you just sign contracts and that's your relationship with everything, and not realizing that the issue is not that you're part of a group that existed before you were born, and you're sort of born into these conventions and these expected social norms and relationships, and it's just the reason the state is bad is because it's coercive, not because it's an organization per se or that it has relationships between humans beyond the individual. So, yeah, that's the way I've seen it, that they're realizing they don't like the state's version of collective group associations and therefore conclude all such things are patently evil.
Right. And I think, again, that comes from this romantic individualistic notion that the desires of your heart are truly your own. You know, as if people just desire to have a big house and a BMW because they intrinsically find them objectively, valuable, rather than the fact that their desires are stoked and inflamed and modeled by those around them, whether it's a TV commercial with a celebrity that has a big house that they admire, or it's just the guy down the street that has a better car than they do. And they say, if I could just have that symbol that they seem to own that gives them what I perceive to be a better sense of being. They're more satisfied in their being, right? If I could just have that, if I could just keep up with the Joneses, so to speak, then I would make it. Then I'd be satisfied, right? But that's an illusion. And I think the Christian understanding of desires is helpful. I think it's helpful that we incorporate this healthy skepticism of desire into Christian rhetoric. Into libertarian rhetoric, because I don't think that libertarian rhetoric on its own will ever meet the needs, will ever scratch the existential itch, so to speak, of the average Joe. I don't think that me and my inalienable rights is ever going to be a sales pitch that will really resonate with the hearts of the average person. That's why it's perpetually a ghettoized concept. It's always left for, people who are more left-brained, people who are more analytical, and they want to study these abstract ideas. They're not abstract. They're pretty practical. I'm not, but I think we're always going to be marginalized to the book club set as long as we don't understand the robust kind of full package picture that Christianity provides. If we incorporate that, even if we're secular, I think we should be able to incorporate Christian concepts of the self and self-restraint and virtue and not giving in to desires all the time. I think we should be able to incorporate that seamlessly into our liberty.
Yeah, I think you're right that there is a certain emptiness to it, and that might explain why it is that only a certain demographic seems to be attracted to libertarianism as it's been conventionally popularized, at least in the United States. That and why is it that so many people fall for the appeal of socialism? And I think you're right, because socialism, at least on the surface, says we are the social system. We're the ones that are going to take care of the poor and the sick. And certainly Ayn Rand's version of market capitalism explicitly says, that selfishness is a virtue, and you can see how that would turn off a lot of people, and vice versa, how it would only attract a certain type that would reinforce these stereotypes. So you could understand a young person. Hayek has a quote where I'm paraphrasing, but he's explaining the significance of Ludwig von Mises' book on socialism. Hayek says something like, when that first came out, it was shocking because in my time, all the best men were socialists. And, of course, what he meant was that was the moral thing to be, because that was the system that wanted to take care of people. So you're right. I think there is a problem, even just in terms of marketing, if capitalism and market economics and freedom, as you and I understand that term, if that comes off as being saying, oh, just look out for yourself, and it's always viewed as the reason we're against Obamacare is because who are you to put a surtax on my $1 million plus income, as opposed to, no, I really sincerely want to help the sick, and giving the government more power is going to actually make it worse in the long run.
Precisely. That's exactly where I'm getting at. So my basic gist of this argument is that libertarianism, as the rhetoric is often construed and the arguments are laid out, is a me-oriented frame. And it doesn't mean it's inherently immoral or selfish. I'm not saying that. I'm saying it's a me-oriented concept, right? And so Christianity, if we do a Christian leavening of liberty, the Christian rhetoric would be a you or an other-focused rhetoric. So it would not be about, well, it's my inalienable right to have a bazooka and fire it off, and you can't tell me what to do, and I should be able to smoke opium and fire off my bazooka and leave me the heck alone. It's like, what about the other approach, which is like this? Do you have a moral right to use violence against your neighbor to stop a nonviolent behavior? Just that simple concept, right? So I don't think I'm ever going to be able to persuade the average Joe that, arguments about the 16th Amendment being unconstitutional and the economic distortions and destruction that the income tax creates. I don't think they'll ever get it. I don't think they'll ever be moved by those arguments. But you know what I think they might be moved by? If you paint the story, if you tell the story of someone like Irwin Schiff, who resisted taxation because he morally objected to it, and he tried to teach others about it. Now, again, I'm not saying whether his arguments were valid or not. Just table that. I'm talking about the human interest story of the Irwin Schiff story, and saying this is an elderly man who died chained to his bed, dying of cancer, was unable to see his grandchildren and hug them.
Right.
And you could say, what was the grievous sin that put this man in a cage? If you wanted to give the status, give him a little bit of a room to argue, you'd say, okay, let's siege your argument. Let's say, yeah, it was greedy. I don't think he was, but let's just assume, okay, he was greedy. Would you cage an elderly man because he's greedy?
Right.
And when you focus it on the other, how do I love my neighbor? I think it resonates with the average person. So it cuts through all the fat, right? It cuts through all but what about the rich and they have to pay their fair share and all this stupid stuff. And, it cuts through the rational arguments that appeal to the geeks, and it just gets right to the heart of the human morality of it all, right? To say, why is an elderly man being caged in the 21st century? It seems so barbaric and brutish and vulgar and ugly and just antiquated, like something from a superstitious medieval time. The idea that you would cage and you would cage a man who's elderly for the sin of perhaps being greedy with his money, not wanting to share it with the collective enough.
Right. I agree entirely. And I think you're right, too, that anecdote really does make it tangible, that this isn't some abstract thing about money, but ultimately when they say taxation is voluntary in our system, and you realize, well, no, not really. They rely on voluntary compliance, but yeah, if you don't pay and they say you owe them, they have the right to come do that according to their rules.
And I call telling stories of victims, I call it the gospel technology. Because if you think about the story of Jesus, right, it's the Gospels, it's eyewitness accounts of the wrongful persecution and death of Jesus Christ, right? And so you see in the Gospel stories, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you see Jesus wrongfully accused, wrongfully persecuted, abandoned and rejected by his community, and killed, isolated from no support. Even his own followers were drawn into the crowd frenzy and would stay silent and abandon him like Peter did. Right?
Mm-hmm.
So the telling of that story is a disinfectant that opens up. That's what Paul talks about when he says, if the powers of the air knew, which is a reference to the governments and kingdom authorities. He said, if the government knew, if these systems of evil knew what they were doing when they crucified the Lord of glory, they wouldn't have done it. Because when they did it, when they put God through our meat grinder of sacrificial violence, God broke the system from within. And his innocence, his radical innocence and nonviolence in the face of this vulgarity of the crowd was so powerful that by just simply telling the story of his wrongful persecution, it unmasked the system that had killed him, to the point where when Jesus resurrects, it creates this dissenting community within the Jewish community. There's not unanimity. In the story of Oedipus Rex, the crowd is unanimous. Oedipus, they write the story. Oedipus is guilty of all the crimes. Oedipus says it himself in the story. They write the victim's lines in for him. The victors write history. So they write in, Oedipus says, I'm guilty of all the things you've told me that I'm guilty of. It's true. I am the cause of the plague. I have broken these taboos of patricide and incest. It's all true. I'm guilty, and I am the cause of the calamity of the town, and I will blot my eyes out and leave the community. So this is an example of a successful sacrificial myth being written. Whereas with Jesus, because he's innocent and because the Gospels tell the story of his innocence, it breaks the system. Because now we have a dissenting opinion. We have a group of people, the early church, saying, no, you killed the Lord of glory. You killed God himself. And by telling that story, by showing his wrongful persecution, it affected the communities that this story of the gospel spread to. And so what I'm suggesting is we libertarians, if we really want to harness the power of the gospel, we should take that technology, show the stories of the victims of wrongful persecution in the state system, and that will undo and unmask and defang over time the power of the state in its ability to sacrifice people for its own desire.
Yeah, I think you're right on both counts. That's certainly part of the reason that the Christian gospel is so compelling, is that people just get drawn in by the story and they realize, yeah, an innocent man was killed, and that's just gripping as a narrative, and that for sure the way to illustrate. A better way to get across the injustice of the current coercive system is certainly not to hold up a billionaire and say, their dividends were taxed and, arguably that's inefficient. You should. So, yeah, I think you're right.
So I'm basically talking about just continuing the revelatory power of telling the stories of our victims, right? Because the drug user that's thrown in a cage where they have a high probability of facing violence. I was just talking to John Beza. You know John Beza?
Yeah.
And he was, he worked as a corrections officer. And I asked him, what's the probability that even if you're a nonviolent person, you're going to have to engage in violence if you want to survive in prison? He said it's close to 100%,
Mm-hmm.
So even if you wanted to be a man of peace, you can't be if you're thrown away in our prison underbelly system. And so this idea that if we expose this evil, this dark stuff that we don't want to talk about, we just talk about it indirectly, like, well, don't drop the soap. We just laugh in this kind of like it's like a guilty pleasure of our community.
And that's, even putting aside people's, political views and whatever, you're right. That is a perverse element of our modern society where male prison rape is considered to be funny, or even like that's sort of like an offhand, like that's really what the punishment is. In other words, it's not so much that you're deprived of your liberty to walk around, but that if you get convicted of something serious and go to prison, that you might very well be sexually assaulted, and that's kind of a part of the issue. That's part of what your punishment is. So it is amazing. Whereas, of course, if that had been officially that coming from the judge's lips, everyone will recoil and say, oh, no, we're a barbaric society if we did something like that. But yet everybody knows about it so much that it's actually, like you say, the feature of jokes.
It's like our guilty pleasure, isn't it?
Right, yeah, that it's sort of, oh, you did such and such, and so, yeah, you'll say hello to Big Joe in the slammer for me, ha-ha, And then
tell that to Jedediah, who's in prison for selling raw milk as an Amish farmer, right?
Right.
Or tell that to the guy that's selling natural supplements, and FDA criminalizes commercial speech if you don't have a patented substance that can afford the $100 million FDA system, to get approved. So yeah, you've got all these nonviolent people, and again I asked another corrections officer, I said, what's the likelihood if I'm a raw Amish farmer, if I sell raw milk, Amish farmer, what's the likelihood I'm going to have to interact with the violent gang population? He said, it's a fact. You will have to. Even if we put you in the hole, you're still going to be around violent people. And it's like, how is this even a thing? How is this something that we're just like, oh yeah, sure, that's just another little factor of life. Okay, go back to my newspaper. Like, what the hell is that? This is like to me, this is like a humanitarian outrage. You know, we talk about helping the kids in Africa, but good Lord, look in our own neighborhoods, right? I mean, the fact that nonviolent people are thrown into basically assault cages, even if there's like a 10% increase in assault, that's likely to happen. That is an injustice beyond all injustice. It's like a humanitarian crisis in our own community.
Yeah, you're right. And even besides the intrinsic immorality of that also, unless they're in there for life, once they get out from that sort of experience, they're probably going to have a higher rate of recidivism and so on. The familiar pattern of somebody goes in for petty larceny or something, then comes out as an armed robber because they interacted with those people and they show them the ropes and so forth too. Or horrible things happen to them, and that just makes them more jaded when they get out.
Let me ask you a question. You know how our culture is very victim-obsessed? Here a victim, there a victim, everywhere a victim, you know?
Yeah.
Why is it that if we're so obsessed with victim outrage that there's seemingly no big, huge impetus to correct this whole humanitarian crisis that's on our own doorstep, so to speak? Of laws against nonviolent behavior. That's what I'm talking about.
Because at first I thought you meant about like prison rape particularly, and there I was going to say because I think that conflicts with the feminist narrative, and so that would be my explanation for that one. But if you mean more broadly, the specific victims of certain state injustice, I'm just throwing this out. I haven't thought it through fully, but it occurs to me that it might be because typically, when you say in our culture it's victim this, the response is very often that's why the state needs to do such and such to break down, these powerful private institutions that are fostering this victimization. And so it wouldn't really work with that sort of worldview to say, oh no, but the state itself is actually the one creating the victims. Because that's the agency of liberation and righteousness for these people.
Yeah, I mean, I guess what I'm getting at is like, why is there such an obsession with foul speech? You said the wrong word and it's insensitive to a racial group, or there wasn't enough nominations of black directors and actors in Oscars, right? Like that creates a trending outrage on Twitter, right? But you'll never see any such popular outrage in our culture for like the fact that there's millions of black people in prison for broken taillights, suspended driver's license, driving with suspended license, late child support payments. They never seem to be able to scratch the actual itch of actual violence committed. It seems like speech, like foul speech or these kind of gestures of culture are more outrageous than actual obscene violence committed every day in our prison system against nonviolent people. Yeah,
I suppose in fairness, the one area where I do see that is like with the Black Lives Matter and so on, that they, in terms of police, the disproportionate killing, that sort of thing. Like, so if a white police officer shoots an unarmed black teenager or something, people will rally around that and say this is part of a broader problem. But you're right, that's really the only example of that I can think of. And you're right, they focus on things that, in an absolute sense, just pale in comparison to the injustices that are unleashed by the state on the civilian population all the time. So that is interesting. And again, I really don't have anything more as profound to say, because I think part of it is that the state is the vehicle to right all these alleged wrongs. And so it kind of undercuts your own position if you're focusing on how's the state hurting. Because even with the police stuff, it's not that they say, yeah, maybe we should get rid of government monopoly police provision. Instead, it's we need to educate white officers so they're not so racist. You know what I mean? Like even there, it's the broader culture and, the America that's the fault. It's not so much, gee, maybe if there were competing police agencies, if one of them was too aggressive, then they would go out of business.
Right, and yeah, exactly. My point is they're always shifting the solution to this kind of nebulous thing like sensitivity training. Like, how could you even measure whether that was accomplished or not? Like if you you mandated sensitivity training by all police forces. They had to take sensitivity training to make them less racist, so to speak. Like, how would you even enforce whether it actually happened? And so that's like where all the focus, all the energy of outrage, someone's shot for selling unlicensed cigarettes. And the focus is on maybe that guy was a little too racial in his bias, as opposed to why the heck did you send armed agents to deal with cigarettes to begin with? Right? There's no actual systematic principled stand against criminalization of nonviolent behavior, period. It's always this kind of misdirection away from the state, right?
Right, and I think the reason is because the people, again, we're speaking in broad generalities here, but I think the people dominating that kind of conversation in U.S. politics and on social media, they are budding totalitarians at heart. So it's not that they want to have people living in freedom. So they don't mind that there's this powerful state apparatus with the ability to direct everyone's lives and to say you can't smoke this, you can't drink that, you can't do whatever. It's just they might disagree with the particulars of how it's been deployed thus far, but they want to retain that machinery.
Yeah. I like to say that speech is violence in our age, and violence is passé. So actual violence is passé. It's kind of like ho-hum, whatever. But speech or differentiation, where it looks like someone is being excluded because of their race, that's where all the violence is in our culture. So if you use foul speech, so Trump uses vulgar rhetoric against, say, Muslims, that's more violent in our culture than actually bombing Muslims quietly like Obama did, right? Like in our history books written by the victimists and the politically correct, Trump is considered anti-Muslim because he's more vulgar with his speech towards them and more brutal, just saying, kind of like not the politically correct terms to describe situations with them. Right. Whereas Obama is considered a defender and an advocate of Muslims, even though he murdered, countless thousands of innocent, nonviolent Muslims overseas for no reason other than whatever Machiavellian reason he was forced to do so.
Yeah, you're right. And also, another example of that sort of pattern is with this campus speech stuff, that some provocative speaker from the right is going to go give a talk, and then people are making it clear, if this person comes, we're going to riot and set buildings on fire and smash windows. And so then the speech is canceled because, that speaker is going to promote violence. It's like, no, it's the exact opposite. It's the enemies of the speaker are the ones literally using violence and destruction, whereas this person was just raising controversial topics and perhaps being insensitive with his humor. And so, this is this weird inversion, like you say, where actual violence, like people are making jokes about punch a Nazi, and I realize many of them really don't mind. They think, if somebody's really voicing views that I find reprehensible and someone literally punches the person to shut them up, I'm fine with that. No big deal.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I think the scapegoat mechanism that's at play with the government is what really needs to be highlighted in our interactions as liberty people, which is the state is a religious enterprise. It's a sacrificial machine that creates awe-inspiring sacred devotion to its functions, right? And so if we don't identify it for what it really is, which is a superstition that allows us to believe that it's okay and it's not violent if we do things as a collective that we ourselves individually would find morally reprehensible to carry out ourselves, if we don't dispel the superstition that if we get a large enough crowd together to do something immoral, somehow it's okay. That's a very barbaric, superstitious concept, which is at the very heart of the state's existence. And I think Jesus was dispelling that notion when he said, basically, who's going to cast the first stone?
Right.
Because, when you're the 45th guy in the crowd throwing stones, it's like a knee-jerk reaction. You just throw the stone almost like it's a motor function of your knee or something. You don't realize that actually I have moral agency here, and I'm responsible for this person's death. You don't see that when you're hidden in the crowd. And so I say that Jesus's confrontation of the crowd to defend the victim is the first act of deconstructing collectivism in history.
Mm-hmm.
because he's getting people to take personal responsibility for the violence they're about to carry out. So that's kind of where I'm getting at, is that we should use the Christian story to reach to our African American brothers and sisters, our Hispanic brothers and sisters, our liberal Christian brothers and sisters, and say, hey, 70% of America says they want to be like Jesus, right? They say they're Christians.
Mm-hmm.
So what does that mean? What does that look like? Does it mean we can throw our stones? Or does it mean we have to refrain from doing that?
Yeah, I think that's a good perspective. Also, I mean, this is perhaps commonplace to you, but it's well known that there's aspects of the modern environmentalist movement that make it like a religion. You know, we have to acknowledge humanity's guilt. We have to atone for our sins. You know, Mother Nature's mad at us, that sort of thing. And, you know, and we have to punish ourselves. And also, of course, you know, communism in the 20th century, too, that a lot of people were like, that really became like the god of these people. And so I think it's ironic that a lot of atheist libertarians conclude like, oh, yeah, just like they felt susceptible to religion in the past, they got rid of that superstition, and then they embraced the modern ones. Whereas from a Christian perspective, I would say, yeah, it's because humans are built. They have this need to be a part of something bigger than them and to worship a being that's more powerful and wiser and more just than they are. And so if you take away God, you know, the God of the Bible, don't be shocked when people turn to other things. They're not going to just be this rational calculator the way some libertarians think people ought to be.
Exactly. So that's what I'm just to kind of summarize again, the state is a religious enterprise. It's founded on superstition, which scratches spiritual itches for collective bodies. And I think these collective bodies that the state creates with its adherents and faithful worshipers are wicked to their core. And we can't judge them as different from us because we have to say, forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do. But at the same time, we have to expose to them kindly and graciously, give them a mirror to see the violence that's going on when we vote, when we sit on a jury and say guilty, throw the nonviolent person in a cage. We have to deconstruct that and do it in a way that doesn't, moralize and condemn them as less than us, but to see them as ourselves, to see, hey, I can see how I could get caught up in a group frenzy as well and do very immoral stuff. Because it's like when you get into a collective mind, it's like you're almost possessed by the crowd, and I think that's how the government gets its power. It's this moral obfuscation of the crowd mind that it thrives off of, right? And I think Jesus, whether you believe he was God or not, Jesus is the one person in history that really treats the powers, which is what the state is, for what it really is, which is this kind of perverse, satanic, accusatory power of the crowd.
I guess just to play devil's advocate, no pun intended, what would you say if somebody heard your like a secular libertarian heard what you're saying and he or she says, okay, but come on, let's be frank here. Probably some of the staunchest supporters of the drug war and foreign occupation of other lands by the military are coming from evangelical churches in the United States. So how can you be saying, isn't it ironic then that maybe perhaps some of your chief opponents are some of the staunchest Christians around? And so, wouldn't they just say, yeah, the message of the Bible is there's moral absolutes, none of this wishy-washy, and drug use is wrong, and you got to, the consequences of sin and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I would just say, that they're just because they use the word Jesus doesn't mean they're imitating Jesus. So Jesus says, be like me. He doesn't say worship me as Hercules. Right. And the average church parishioner, unfortunately, I think is largely taught a gospel that objectifies Jesus as an idol. So to paint this into a biblical story, look at like the story of Peter walking on water. The way the average evangelical has presented Jesus, they would stay in the boat trembling in fear, worshiping Jesus for walking on water. But that's not the picture that Jesus gives us in that story. Jesus says, you, Peter, get out of the water, get up, get out of the safety of the boat, and do like I do. Be me, become me, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that becoming, the imitation of Jesus, I think is lost in the average popular Christian imagination, so that Jesus becomes basically just another idol. You say, Well, it's just another religion for the average Christian, where it's like, okay, well, there's somebody in charge up there, right? Yeah, well, who is it? Well, it's Jesus. Okay, check, got that one right. Okay, well, you feel kind of guilty for being a bad person, right? Yeah, I do. Well, say uncle to Jesus. So you're like, all right, uncle, I give up. It's Jesus. You're the big guy. You're the tough guy. All right. And then so you do your little checklist, but have you really done anything to become like Jesus? Do you look more like Jesus? Do you not resist evil with violence as Jesus commands those who want to imitate him? I mean, even the little things like the fact that Jesus was born, by all intents and purposes, he was born of a woman who looked very much evil to her community, right?
Right.
She was basically an adulterous woman. She was the most ill repute woman you could imagine in her community, from her community's perspective, right? And God says, I choose that situation to come into the world. What does that tell us about our priorities as Christians? We're so obsessed with, avoid the appearances of evil, right? But apparently it doesn't matter so much to God. He chose to come into a birth situation in which he would make his parents look like adulterers, fornicators, right?
Right.
So obviously God's expectations are different from the classical, unfortunately, church crowd. But he says that's what's going to happen. He says you will know the scriptures, but you won't see me. So he says that. And the people who studied him, the people who had breakfast, lunch, and dinner with Jesus every day in Israel, his own disciples, they missed it over and over again. They missed his point every day. They'd say, okay, Jesus, who's going to be on your left side and who's going to be on your right side when you become William Wallace and take this thing by force? And he's like, gosh, you guys don't get it. You don't get it. I tell you this every day and you don't get it, And Peter says, hey, Lord, tell me you're not going to die on the cross. And he says, get behind me, Satan. You know not the things of God, but the things of men, right? And that word Satan means accuser. So he's saying, get behind me, accuser. You're accusing me of doing the things of man when I've got the things of God in mind, right?
Right.
And so there's this sense that the average church parishioner worships a disembodied Hercules Jesus, which is just another pantheon of gods. Okay, well, you used to worship Zeus, and this guy used to worship Thor. Well, we worship a guy named Jesus, and that's all there is to it. So let's just keep treating people basically like Thor would treat them. It's like you haven't. There's no radical transformation of you're not turning the other cheek. You're not washing the feet of those who are beneath you. You're not doing any posturing which radically imitates the actual demands of Jesus for those who seek to use his name.
Right, and it's I guess all I would add is I enjoyed your remarks a lot there, but also, in terms of, because you're right, I've talked with some sort of, you call them right-wing hawk Christians, U.S. Christians, and they're looking at what does God in the Old Testament do in particular, and saying, we want to. But I think clearly, in terms of God's model for how do we behave as humans, is what he did is Jesus. And so, yes, Jesus is God, but also God in the form of a man, and therefore, we emulate him. And you're right. Certainly, it would be completely out of character for Jesus to see someone sinning and then go kill the person or go put him in a cage. You know what I mean? That's just against everything he tried to do through his examples there. So it's, yes, there are moral absolutes, but it's it's up to God to punish evildoers, and that's so. I think you're exactly right in terms of the full reading of the Bible. That in terms of the example that we as humans are to emulate, Jesus was showing the way to deal with sin. Was not to deny it, of course. He doesn't say, to the adulteress at his feet, or to say who's the first to, he was without sin, cast the first stone, and then say to her, don't worry about it, you didn't do anything wrong. No, he says, go and don't sin anymore. So he's not denying that she was sinning. So he's not being a moral relativist, but yet saying, we don't need to, or saying a blameless person would have the ability to go ahead and cast the stone. But since you're a bunch of hypocrites, if you do it, because you're all sinners as well.
Yeah, the cultural right wants to stone the woman for adultery, and the cultural left wants to stone Jesus for telling her not to do adultery anymore.
That's a great point. I didn't think of that. You're right. So the only real consistent person in that is Jesus himself.
And that's kind of our message that we have to have. I think we will make great strides. You can take Jesus to Ferguson, Missouri with the Black Lives Matter protesters. You can take them there, and you can have currency with those people if you can have a conversation with them. What would Jesus do here? How does Jesus expect us to treat our neighbor? What does Jesus say about the human heart? Is white guilt worse than black guilt, or are all human hearts, the line between good and evil, does it run right through the human heart? Because that's what God would say, right? That's what Jesus would say in his teachings. And so you walk people through. I'd say that this way. You take Ayn Rand, take Bastiat, take Murray Rothbard, take von Mises to the Ferguson, Missouri protesters. They don't care. Say, well, let me tell you how von Mises dealt. They say, who? Why do I care? What? Take Rothbard. Well, who? I mean, and it doesn't mean that they're bad people, but my point is that look at how much more beautiful and how much more bridge building we have if we say, what would Jesus do? Let's walk through this. Would Jesus throw a stone? Would Jesus scapegoat the police? Or would Jesus look at the power system and say, why are we sending armed agents to deal with nonviolent people? Why are we sending an armed agent to say, hey, check your taillight? I mean, come on. That's a demonic culture right there. You send deadly force to say, hey, check your taillight. You might cause a wreck one day. I mean, this is absurd, right? There's no neighborly love in any of this system. And I think Jesus, if we bring him up, we can go to Hispanic communities who say, I don't really know anything about Rothbard, von Mises, Bastiat. I don't know anything about those people, but when you tell me about Jesus, it makes me reflect. It makes me think about my roots. It makes me think about the stories that I share with you in commonality, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that this message of sharing Jesus in the liberty movement, not only is it a wonderful opportunity to spread the gospel, but it's also a wonderful opportunity to build bridges so that our culture can heal from all this racial division and, ethnic and economic divisions that our society keeps having.
Yeah, I think you're right, and certainly since there are so many people in these communities that are actual Christians, that's a very easy starting point. But I think you're right too that beyond that, because I can imagine a lot of secular libertarians listening to this saying, okay, that's fine and well for those of you who believe that stuff, but I don't believe that, so I'm certainly not going to cater to something that I think is just purely a myth. But I think with your remarks earlier were getting at it as well, that it's not simply a matter of using Jesus or not. It's this matter of, I think the appeal of the interventionist left, let's call it for lack of a better term, is that this group mentality, and they are catering to certain motivations and desires that people have. And if libertarians confine themselves to rugged individualism, they are only going to keep appealing to that narrow spectrum of people for whom that's appealing. And there's a whole broader group that, I mean, it's like I've often been struck by, maybe this is partly where you're coming from too. When I go to a libertarian event, the people who show up, they're upper middle class white men. I'm generalizing, but that's roughly true. And they're the ones who are least likely to be victimized by the state in our current society. And so it's interesting that whereas the truly victimized groups are the ones who are most afraid of libertarians and don't trust them, when they would be helped the most if the political scene were to tilt more libertarian. And so it's a weird disconnect that, and I don't know exactly how to fix that, but I think what you're talking about may be one of the major problems.
Yeah, I agree with you. That's where I'm getting at, is that we're not scratching the itch to make any real progress, right? Like Martin Luther King resonated with the country, and the liberty message should be resonating on the same level. It really should, It really should. But the reason why it's not is that we're not packaging it properly. And it's not just a marketing thing. It's a heart thing, too. But, and I tell people, you mentioned the secular libertarian stuff. And it's like, I've been surprised. I go and do this speech at different groups and secular groups, and I'm surprised at the atheists and agnostics that say, I never knew Jesus did all this. Mm-hmm. I never knew Jesus deconstructed the pagan violence of the state. I didn't know that. I thought Jesus was all about, hey, just, be careful, little eyes, what you look at kind of thing, little Sunday school Jesus. I didn't know that there was like all this teeth to Jesus being this founder of this new movement, this new world order of reality that's going to upend everything we think is sacred and think is untouchable, right?
Right.
And so when you present Jesus in this, it's just presenting Jesus instead of kind of couching him in all this kind of sterilized theological packaging. We just kind of present the real Jesus. I'm surprised at how many atheists say, man, I want to learn more about Jesus. I want to read his books. And it's like, why not? I mean, we read Steve Jobs' biographies that are 400 pages because he created the iPod and gave us Toy Story. But Jesus split time. Wouldn't you want to study a guy who's that powerful if you don't even think he's God? You know, if you don't think he's God, what you want to like, if that guy can split time, so literally we count our time as this is the year 2017 from the year of our Lord. Right? What? I mean, that's still, we split time over a man. That's a serious person. You should study that guy. Whether you don't agree with anything, you think you don't agree with him or not. Like, anybody, if he's just a man, he's the greatest man of history who ever lived.
Right.
I mean, empires were fought in his name, the greatest scientific discoveries, economic theories, hospitals, every kind of concept you can almost imagine in the Western world was inspired by the name of Jesus, opening up this paradigm of prosperity wherever it went. Not some perfect prosperity, but it kind of fits and starts, just like the Bible says that the kingdom of heaven works itself like a yeast in a loaf. It's a slow process. It doesn't happen overnight. And so this leavening that Christianity has provided to the world is the most radical, transformative, beautiful aesthetic one could imagine. And the idea of just kind of throwing that away because you're not convinced of all the theology of Christianity is absurd. You're missing out on so much of what makes Western tradition and Western values of freedom and so forth so beautiful to begin with.
Yeah, I think you hit on something a minute ago there about this image a lot of atheists or just, agnostics have about him. I think they get the picture of a Christian from like Ned Flanders on The Simpsons, who's just a complete doormat for people, but real chipper and everything, and they think that that's what Jesus went around saying nice things and, hey, try to be more friendly to people, and then when you realize, well, no, there's a reason they killed him, that he had scathing rebukes of the powerful elite in his society, and they had to take him out because he was a threat to their power. I mean, that's a version that sometimes doesn't come through, I think. Yeah,
precisely. And even his concept of turning the other cheek, that's a proactive, nonviolent way of disarming violence, right? I mean, of evil. Because I tell people, you know that logic that people say, if you legalized drugs, it would basically eliminate the black market, right? Because when you would, and what that is that's the turning of the cheek principle that Jesus is teaching. If you use nonviolence to deal with vices, it has a way of crippling evil, such as selling drugs and so forth. If you find that to be sinful, Jesus' turning of the cheek principle is a way of proactively dismantling that evil, because the desires of profit that a drug gang has, when they reach for that evil without violence resisting it, right? The violence is the drug war. If you remove that violence, if you say turn the other cheek to that violence, it's a proactive way of allowing the desire for profit of the gang leader to basically dissipate its own power, right? Because if you legalize the drugs, literally the cartels would go away. They would collapse. And if you legalize consenting prostitution, the other funding source of these wicked cartels would collapse. Because if you can go on Amazon and get your coca leaf tea, the guy that sells drugs on the corner is not going to be in business anymore.
Right.
It would be just as well if he sold turnips than if he sold some kind of cocaine, right?
Right, and the other problems plaguing the inner city in particular would just be so much alleviated if you did pull that violence out of it. That's something that I noted. I think even a lot of libertarians who haven't been around sort of bad neighborhoods and big cities, they have this idea that, the police are impotent there. And that's not really the case. The police go through there, but they're like an occupying army, like literally. Like I've been in places like around Harlem where in broad daylight, police cars going one way and then something call comes in and they pull a U-turn And there were like women on the street with strollers, like really quickly getting out of the way because the car might have hit them. And the police didn't drive like that, you know, in the financial district. They would be much more careful to not just all of a sudden whip the car around. So I'm just saying it's I think people, even though they might in the abstract say, oh, yeah, legalize drugs or whatever, but I don't think they realize how much violence there is. It's like a war-torn – I mean, they call it the drug war, and that's not even a metaphor. It really is the same tactics that are used if the U.S. military were going to go try to pacify, in quotation marks, some foreign population where there were people that were armed and they were trying to dispel those groups.
Right, but and see, what I'm trying to get at is that the teaching of Jesus is not some kind of Ned Flanders sit down and be sweet. No, it's a proactive, strategic way of dismantling the evil power systems like drug gangs by allowing them to fall on the own weight of their own desire. So they're based on fragile weight. And once you expose them to market forces, that voluntarism, it creates a situation in which they're not able to maintain their power structure anymore. And so it doesn't mean that you eliminate the fact that of course there will always be some scumbag trying to sell something. But if he's selling something tainted with a market, then you can have the victim has recourse, right? If you're selling a faulty product that you've tainted with poison and the customer doesn't know about it, there's recourse available for in a private property-based, Christian-based society. So if you care about victims and if you care about stopping cycles of violence, you have to know the way of the cross. You have to understand that this is not some sentimental, sweet gesture, but it's actually a very proactive, strategic, I call it like Aikido. Jesus is practicing cultural Aikido to dismantle wicked power structures by nonviolence.
That's great, yeah. And I think, yeah, your point, I'm glad you emphasized that again, that if someone says he's a pacifist or just in general a Christian who's going to use nonviolence to try to disarm evil that way, people think that means, oh, so you're just going to sit back and do nothing while we got to pick up. And no, it is a very conscious thing. When I was in Nashville, I went to the museum there, and they had a whole exhibit about the civil rights marches and the nonviolent techniques and so on. And I was amazed at how intricate and strategic it was. Like there was training seminars saying, okay, we're going to go do a sit-in at this lunch counter, and if the mob comes and starts punching people, like how they would rotate among their groups. Like so if someone on the outer perimeter is really taking a beating, we'll rotate and bring him into the middle of us and put new people on the outside, and they can take the blows and engage the people punching you, engage them in conversation. Like, why are you punching me? What have I done to you? And not, clearly. So it's not just don't punch back, but a whole system of how are we going to deal with this, because it's not naive at all. It's in fact very wise and sophisticated.
Yeah, very good. Well, hey, it's been a pleasure speaking with you, and I don't want to take up any more time, although I've really enjoyed our discussion. I could go on and listening and kind of riffing off of each other here. But how can people find your website or anything they want to be in touch with, maybe new books or content that you have out that you'd like to spread awareness to?
Well, sure. So the book that I have out that I'm pointing people to is called Choice from the Independent Institute, and that's sort of my distillation of the work of Ludwig von Mises, an introduction to Austrian economics. And my website, where I have it's the clearinghouse of anything I've got going on, is consultingbyrpm.com.
Well, very good. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Robert Murphy, I've enjoyed our discussion. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, I've had a great time as well. Thanks for having me.